So I'd really like to welcome Aisha, Melissa and colleagues from the GLA's community engagement team, who are going to talk to us about the GLA's work on applying community insights into policy. And then after that presentation, the GLA have got a couple of areas for discussion that we'll discuss in breakout rooms, and that'll be an opportunity to share your takeaways from the presentation, but also share the work that you're doing or kind of considering in terms of applying community insights into policy. And kind of while Aisha and Melissa introduce yourselves, do introduce yourselves in the chat. Obviously, it's got quite a few people here, so we won't do verbal introductions, but do introduce yourselves in the chat in terms of who you are, you know, kind of the organisation you're here from, your role, and also kind of what brings you here today. You might just be like really curious about what we mean by community insights and policy, or you might be doing active work or active thinking in the subject. And it's always really good to get those introductions in the chat, because kind of people can get a sense of who else is in the room and kind of what other work is taking place. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Aisha and Melissa to take us through your work. So over to you.
Thank you, Noel. Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you again to Noel and to the network for giving us this opportunity to come and speak to you today. So as Noel said, my name's Aisha. I'm a Principal Community Engagement Officer at the GLA, working under the current Mayor of London. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Melissa. Melissa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Melissa and I work alongside Aisha in the GLA Community Engagement team as a Community Engagement Officer. And I'm just going to open the slides for us all now.
Thank you. So today we're going to be sharing some of our work that's focused on how we can better connect community insights to policy for London. And when we talk about community insights and community-led insight, we're mainly sort of referring to non-traditional forms of data and insight collection. And I think COVID-19 in particular has enabled us to really understand the kind of nuances of community experience, because we've just had to understand it through different platforms and different mediums. And that's included things like video and film and podcasts and photos and kind of online diaries and storytelling, Instagram accounts, etc., all of which have provided a huge amount of value in terms of understanding community experience of the pandemic in particular, but also lots of other issues in the city. And for us, it's of equal value to hard data and statistics. So I think it's been described in our organisation by a few people as community-led insight adds colour to the numbers. So that's very much how we think about it. Community-led insight is that it gives that fuller picture and understanding of the experiences of London's diverse communities. So we've tried to condense about 5 years worth of work into a 20-minute presentation. So hopefully you'll go away today with something useful that you can kind of take away in terms of a learning or an interesting project that relates to some of your work. But we're really interested in hearing about the things that you're all doing in your kind of respective areas on collecting community insight. So we've kind of divided the session in 3 parts. So one is around how we better collect, make use and embed community insight to develop policy. Then it's kind of looking at culture change and how we rebalance the importance of community insight to be of equal value to kind of data and kind of empirical data. And then finally, how we better support and mainstream the use of peer researchers, which I think is something that is happening across the city and we're particularly interested in mainstreaming in the GLA. So in terms of the kind of presentation, we'll just run through like 20 minutes of that, and then hopefully an opportunity to ask questions and have a bit of a reflective moment, and then we'll go into breakout rooms, and we've got a few questions that we'd love to kind of discuss with you. So to kind of get us started, I guess the first thing to really reflect on is, why do we need to better connect insight to policy making? And Melissa shared this really poignant quote that I think really summarises it really well. It's about knowledge equity. So the aim of knowledge equity is uniting lived, learned and practice experience to create the wisdom necessary to solve the social, economic and environmental challenges of our time. And that's from the Centre for Knowledge Equity. And I think that really sums up the kind of current challenges that our city is experiencing at the moment, particularly through the lens of recovery from COVID-19, and ensuring that we have all the knowledge necessary to be able to come up with the solutions for some of those challenges that our city is facing now, but also that will kind of have a longer term impact because of what the pandemic has sort of done to the city's social and kind of economic environments. So the other thing is around gathering insights that are authentic and truly representative. So we often tell communities how to speak to us and how to share their information in a way that's palatable and understandable for policy officers to be able to transfer that into the decision-making process, rather than asking them to provide it in a format that suits them. And there was an individual from a community organisation that we met maybe a year and a bit ago, and he was helping us to develop a resource around this very topic, around how you connect community insight to policy. And that quote stayed with all of us, I think, and is very much on the kind of the forefront of our minds. And in his sharing of saying that actually when we tell our stories and when we share our stories, we're not doing it thinking about policy officers and what policy officers are going to do with this. We do it in a way that's authentic to us, that has meaning for us. And actually, it's probably time for us to really reflect on rather than asking people to speak our language in policy terms, how about we try and look at things from their perspective and try to speak their language and understand their experiences through means that are or kind of authentic to them. And I think that very much is the centre of our work in terms of trying to redress the power imbalances that exist in decision-making spaces and information as well. And then it's also around improving research and removing barriers to access. So we often commission consultants to deliver research and do kind of formal kind of consulting with communities, but not necessarily compensating them for their time. So it's also about how we can make communities the researchers and not just the researched, and not just being where things are done to them. And then finally, it's around sharing learning and learning from each other as equals, as people who are in policy making and decision making kind of positions, but also communities on the ground who are experiencing these issues on a day-to-day basis, but also recognizing that that's not a binary relationship, that actually there's lots of people who work in policy spaces that have lived experience of all of these things, but it's recognizing that they are in positions of power, but how can we share the learnings on both sides in a kind of equal footing? So I just want to take you a little bit on a bit of a journey of our team and how we've kind of got here. So the community engagement team at the GLA's core mission is about bridging the gap between communities, City Hall and decision makers. So one of our key focuses of work is around improving systems and process for engagement, with a particular recent focus on London's recovery. So a couple of our core objectives around this work is about identifying opportunities to amplify the voices of communities who face barriers to participation, including structural exclusion, and fostering an equitable relationship between London's diverse communities, but also in embedding the community-led insight into those decisions to inform our understanding of the aspirations and needs of London's community. So we as a team are really interested in collecting, amplifying and embedding community-led insight in the policy making process. So we're obviously interested in new insights and kind of identifying where there's gaps, but also in the existing insights. Communities collect data and information about their experiences every single day. And it's about us really thinking about the non-traditional means of data collection and understanding of communities' experiences in addition to the data that we collect, that kind of formal data that's collected, because we know the data doesn't necessarily tell the full story of people's experiences. So one of the first things that we tried to do I'm going to say many years ago, because 2017 feels like a very long time ago and things have changed a lot since then, but was a citizen-led engagement program. And that was our kind of first step into looking at different methodologies and different ways of collecting community insight. So we trialed a peer-led research program. We grant funded a couple of six community organisations to understand their specific experiences around the topic of social integration, because the Mayor had just launched a policy and strategy around social integration. That project enabled them to kind of develop capacity amongst their organisations of peer research. And I won't go in too much detail about the actual process of it. We can send you a couple of evaluation reports that will give a lot of information around that. I think the main thing that I think you'd probably find most useful is some of the challenges around starting to do this kind of work where we're collecting insight that is community led, that isn't through the means of formal research. So the citizen-led program, we delivered in 2 iterations. One was a pilot project. We did a lot of learning from that, and then did a kind of second round of that. And then the pandemic hit, and we had to sort of shift our focus to a lot of work on recovery and systems and processes around engagement. But I think some of the core challenges around this type of work, one, and I think this is something that's an ongoing thing, and we're really trying to think about how we address this and support policy teams in doing this, is around the confidence in using this type of data. So obviously in a policy making space, we have like the data that we're comfortable using, but if you've been given a podcast and you're being asked to like use that as a means of informing policy, it's not necessarily something that people are trained to do. So I think that is one of the initial things that I think we're really keen to support and understand maybe how that's happening across kind of local authorities and other decision kind of making spaces, in how does that actually happen? How do you actually translate that kind of non-traditional data into something that can be used in policy that isn't necessarily deemed anecdotal but is of equal value to the numerical stuff? And then the other challenge is around the time invested in this type of work. So community-led insight is obviously widely available. One of the things we want to do is amplify that, and Melissa will talk a little bit about that in a minute, about how we've been trying to do that and what we're working on that will be of use hopefully for all of your work as well, is the actual time invested in that work. It's not a quick win. It's not something that you can do in kind of a month and then feel like that's informed policy. I think it's about the relationships that you build with these organizations and the trust that you build with them. And I think unless there's a clear moment of influence and change that can occur as a result of collecting that community insight, that trust can often be compromised. I think it's really important to think about where those clear moments of influence are, and to be really transparent with community organisations when you are collecting this type of data, and when you are asking them to go and do that piece of research, that peer research or participatory action research. I think it's also about maintaining a two-way dialogue throughout the process of a project like this. So making sure that it's not just about collecting the data and then saying, thanks so much, that's great, never going to see you again. It's actually about maintaining a more long-term sustained relationship and thinking about how you can continue to use and build on the insights that communities are collecting on a day-to-day basis through their brilliant work that they're doing every day. I think another thing is around the kind of reflection point. So having that kind of moment of collecting the insight, but also thinking about where can this be used. So you may have an intention of using it in a particular area of policy, but actually how can you share it more broadly? Because more than likely it will have a lot of insight that will inform lots of other areas of policy, not just the one that you're collecting. So I think it's important about thinking about how you platform it. So I think the last challenge, just to highlight, is probably just resourcing as well. So I think, in learning through the citizen-led, we gave a small amount of funding to deliver this piece of work, but actually the pilot and the evaluation kind of uncovered some of the challenges around organisations resourcing to deliver this kind of work. So their actual internal capacity, but also just the financial kind of resourcing in terms of, we do this one project, but then beyond that, we want to kind of add further to this research. And how can we continue to support that? And I think resourcing was always one of the things that came up as a challenge for peer-led research projects, and remunerating people appropriately. And also the question of, we commission formal research organisations and fund them in one way, but actually we fund community organisations at a completely different rate. And that's always been a bit of an issue that has been raised via this type of work. And I think it's something that we need to continually challenge ourselves on, because actually what communities see is that we value academic research more than the research that they undertake, but then there needs to be a kind of reflective moment on actually thinking about how do you demonstrate that they're equal value if you're rewarding them in two different ways. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Melissa to talk a bit about some of our other programmes of work that will be hopefully really interesting in terms of examples of how we're trying to platform community-led experience.
Thanks, Aisha. So Aisha raised, I guess, some of the challenges that came out of the citizen-led programme. And I think we tried to sort of remedy some of these, and also to think a bit outside of the box with our next kind of experiment, which was the London Community Story pilot. And this came about kind of from this idea about communities kind of deciding how they want to share information with us. because often we expect things in like surveys and reports, focus groups, interviews, and actually there are lots of different ways to gather and present information that are less traditional, but people may find a lot easier. So the first kind of methodology that we experimented with was sound, and in 2019 we ran a pilot to test this approach using a mobile audio recording facility called the conversation booth. And in this booth, participants responded to a key question that was crowdsourced by the community. And these conversations, we took them to the community. So rather than them taking place at City Hall, it took place in local libraries, local cultural venues, at a university, and they were unfacilitated. So we didn't go into the conversation with like follow-up questions and someone like prodding the conversation along. It was just conversations between people with a starting point, and that was it. So the conversations provided a snapshot of Londoners' thoughts and feelings in conversation with each other across some key themes. So belonging, digital communities, equality, identity, journeys and travelling, and relationships. And when we share the slides with you, I've included some links to some of the outputs of those conversations. This approach highlighted the power of stories in creating new ways of listening to each other. But there were sort of some challenges in how we could present these stories and show them at their best using the infrastructure that the GLA currently has. So we collected sort of hours and hours of audio. Alongside that, we produced some like short films and also some essays, and just our website couldn't really handle like all these different kinds of information at once. And it was a real back and forth kind of with our web team to try and think of like the best way to present them and the best way for people to be able to access them and see them at their best. And this is something that we're considering sort of up to this day, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But again, these were kind of topics that came out through the conversations, and as Aisha said, we needed to connect them more to sort of policy that policymakers were working on at that time. So we felt that through future work, we could take these principles a step further and bring the non-traditional insights closer to the policymakers and the policymaking process, and sort of bringing policymakers in on the journey as well by including them as partners. So then the next stage was kind of London Community Story, no longer as a pilot, as a full-fledged grants programme. And we launched that in early 2021. And grants were awarded to 20 organisations with existing projects that captured Londoners' experiences of COVID-19 through traditional and creative, non-traditional and creative ways. And this programme came about sort of by speaking with communities. So initially this programme, we were going to commission lots of non-traditional creative responses from communities. And the more people we spoke to, we found that so much was already happening. We also commissioned some research that found, I think, around 160 different community collections related to COVID. And where people were really getting stuck was not with actually collecting material, it was with how they presented it, how they amplified the learning from that material, and how they shared that with policymakers or back to their audiences and back to their communities, because often the funding that they got was only to collect data. So all they'd kind of be able to produce at the end of this massive collection project involving tens of people or even larger groups was just one blog, and it really didn't do the information justice. So the grants programme aimed to support organisations to analyse their collections and present and share them back to decision makers and also to wider audiences. And we worked to connect the recovery missions with this data. So we had lunch and learns where we invited different GLA policy teams along. And we also we've made a home for those outputs as well on the Mayor's Google Arts and Culture platform. So some of the outputs that we got were video. So we had Life on Pause, which is a series of short films that captured young people's voices in North London during the pandemic. We had a sonic clock for nursing, and I'll share the links to some of these towards the end of the presentation so you can all see them, where it's sort of 24 hours in the life of a nurse during the pandemic, and it's lots of like audio testimony, really beautifully linked together. And we also provided training for communities to sort of pull their information together into infographics, and this is one that was produced by Growing Hope, and we have lots more that were produced by different groups, and they had some really excellent training on this that was provided by Superhighways. So I talked a bit about sort of how we shared that information with recovery mission teams. So they were given sort of the copies of the insights. We had these themed group engagement events where 4 or 5 grantees were sharing. And then what we're hoping will happen is at this conference event, which I'll share again the invite with you all at the end of the session, that will happen on the 22nd of March. And we're bringing policymakers and community organisations together to really have conversations, get introduced to each other, and sort of share their experiences of sort of working through the pandemic, some of the things that they'd like to change, some of their successes, and thinking about how we can better work together in the future. Part of this work, we put together a resource called Connecting Community Insights to Policy that provides guidance for policymakers on analysing non-traditional and creative insights, and guidance for community groups on sort of how to collect information in this way, some of the ethical considerations that they'll need to take, and also some of the ways that they can present it back. And there are 6 case studies where communities have managed to have really great influence on policy in their local areas, or even like nationally and internationally, by using these sort of creative methods. So at the beginning, Aisha mentioned these kind of 3 questions that we're considering. And the second one is how we can support culture change to rebalance the importance of community insight. So building from London Community Story, I mentioned the Google Arts and Culture page before, and this was kind of our first attempt at having like a digital home for all of the community stories that needed to be shared and that had been collected throughout our different projects. So on the Google Arts and Culture platform, which should be launching at the end of this month, we have short samples and trailers that introduce audiences to the insights, sort of give them the information at the surface so they can then go to the organisation's pages and find out more. And we've grouped them thematically. So this one, for example, is on multi-generational experiences of the pandemic, and really zooms in on the experiences of like young Londoners and older Londoners and some of the challenges that they faced, whether that was digital connectivity, whether that was sort of lack of social connection, whether that was access to food and resources. And we can really hear how they were affected specifically, rather than always thinking of everyone as a whole. And I think sometimes it's hard for us to really understand what people's experiences were like just by sort of reading reports, or when we hear a figure about how many people sort of didn't have suitable internet connection. When you hear about the experiences of an older man who's living in a residential home, his family can't visit him, and the residential home doesn't have good internet and can't provide him with a tablet to even call his family on Zoom or anything like that. I think some of these stories really hit home when you hear about people's lived experiences. So that was the aim of the Google Arts and Culture. But we had some restrictions with that platform. Google wanted quite a lot of editorial control. So even though we wanted to ideally co-curate the project, we were getting quite a lot of like, why can't you say it like this? Why can't you talk about the organisations in this way? E.g. in Google's words are not their own. So we've got to a point now where we're thinking about a space that we are going to create for communities called an Insights Hub. And we're aiming to create the first kind of community insights hub for London, a one-stop shop for all community-led data that relates to our city, to reconnect us all with the lived experiences of Londoners, and tell the stories behind the text and the data that we're always so used to using to make a case for our work and to evidence and evaluate our policies and programmes. So we're at the very beginning of this journey. There are kind of 3 aspects to it. So we're doing lots of user research with communities and policymakers. We have someone on board to help us design and build prototypes of what the website will look like. And we're doing some research to kind of think about the sort of content that we would like on there. So we've commissioned some research to discover community insights related to a specific recovery mission in 4 boroughs. We're working with a university to do some schools workshops and get some really lovely insights in from children and young people. And we're also planning sort of a small grants programme to sort of plug any gaps with the insights that we've gathered. And I'm going to pass over to Aisha now, who'll talk about kind of the second branch of us supporting people to connect more with community insights, and that's our learning network.
Thank you, Melissa. So this engagement learning network we're really excited about, and I think it's kind of come at a great time in terms of lots of different organisations and boroughs and everyone kind of working on London's recovery from COVID-19. But what we've been hearing a lot is that people would love there to be a space to come and connect and to be able to share the insights that they're gathering from the engagement that they're doing, but also understand sort of like what best practice is happening across the city, how we can share kind of good examples of like successful engagement using different and new ways of engaging communities, particularly those who've been most affected by the pandemic and disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So this network, we are working with an organisation called Choreo, who brilliantly deliver our civic kind of leaders fellowship program called Civic Futures, and they're working closely with us to kind of design and launch a Pan-London engagement learning network this year, so 2022. So it will be there'll be more information about that in the coming months that we'll be able to share with you as a network. So as I said, it's about bringing together everyone working on recovery. And I guess core to the kind of function of a network like this is about amplifying community insight and sharing on a broader platform, as well as the kind of learnings, challenges and successes of engagement that's happening across the city. So we really want the network to foster a culture of collaboration and sort of cross-pollination of data and provide a fuller picture of the experiences of London's diverse communities in the city, based on all the different kind of bodies working on engagement. So we know obviously boroughs and obviously the GLAs doing our kind of formal engagement and things, but there's lots of other organisations in the city, community leaders, civic leaders, academics, creative storytellers, social media influencers who are kind of social activists doing lots of great work on engaging communities and trying to understand their experiences and develop solutions and programmes and policies to support Londoners to thrive. So that network will enable that kind of sharing, and we're really excited to share more about that in the next coming months with you. So if you want to find out more, we've got contact details at the bottom of this slide deck which we can share. So that's the learning network. So that will really hopefully complement a lot of the work of the Insights Hub that Melissa mentioned. And then just the last thing that I'll quickly cover before we go into kind of questions and then breakout is around how we support and mainstream the use of peer researchers. So I touched earlier about how we introduced the peer research model into the organisation back in 2017 and have tried it in different ways, and actually a couple of teams have adopted peer research programmes to inform some of their policies and programmes. I think most recently the skills and employment team, who have been looking at the adult education budget and using kind of peer research to inform some of the kind of key areas of influence and change that they had to support with deciding how that budget is spent and where it's prioritised for particular communities who need the most support. So just to give a kind of overview, I suppose, of the next step for that in terms of peer research is, you know, we're really reflected on what we've done as an organisation in terms of, you know, a bit of peer research in different policy areas, but it's not really a mainstream engagement methodology that is standard practice in the organisation. And I think the evaluations that I've shared in the chat uncovered quite a lot of the challenges around it. So we're at the moment working with an organisation called Traverse, who are supporting us to do a bit of internal kind of review and research of the GLA's use of peer research as an engagement methodology, but also helping us think through some kind of core questions around how do we ensure that the peer research kind of process and the policy making process is more aligned. So I mentioned earlier the challenge around having all of that brilliant insight, but then not necessarily being able to embed that into the policy making process because of timelines and resourcing, and that the fact that it's not really a quick win and it's about kind of investing in relationship. So supporting us to think about recommendations of what the GLA's role is in supporting peer-led research across the city. Because for us, we really want to focus on improving engagement practice in London, but also strengthening that connection between insight and policy making. So hopefully that research from an internal basis will uncover hopefully some core recommendations for us that we'll be able to share across kind of this network and others. And I'm aware that there's lots of really great peer research happening in organisations across the city, like Toynbee Hall, Young Foundation, smaller organisations, as well as local boroughs as well. So I'm sure there's lots of learnings we can take from you all as well, and in terms of how you've done that in your organisations. But I think for us, it's also about how we can think about creating a more timely and effective commissioning process. So we've done it in different ways in the GLA. We've commissioned it in a kind of formal way, but we've also grant funded organisations to do that, and obviously that creates a slightly different relationship when you're working with community organisations. So and different teams do it in different ways, so we're really reviewing the whole kind of way of doing peer research in the organisation and how we can strengthen that, and potentially also create a London-wide network of peer researchers, because as I said, there's lots of great work happening across the city. Can the GLA support in bringing together a network of researchers as a pool of kind of people with expertise and knowledge about their communities who are embedded in them, that can help support to better create policies and programs that better reflect the experiences of London's diverse communities. So that research is happening right now, and if you're interested in that and want to kind of support and participate in that, we're looking for kind of organisations who have done peer research across the city to kind of participate in that research, so we get a fuller understanding of where that's happening well and where there's kind of shared challenges. So again, there's some contact details at the end that we'll share with you if you'd like to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So that's the end of our presentation, which I think was slightly longer than 20, so apologies. I think I went on a little bit too much in the beginning section and took up a bit more time on presentation, but I just really want to open it up before we go into breakout, is if people have any immediate sort of questions or reflections they'd like to share, and then we can move into the breakout rooms and discuss a little bit further on some of these things. Did anyone have any questions or reflections, or we can go straight into the breakouts if people prefer, unless there's something in the chat that I'm missing? Sorry. No, okay. Noel, should we go into the breakout rooms then?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So I'm just going to kind of quickly set them up, but maybe if you want to share the questions while I do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had sort of 3 questions that we'd love to explore in the breakout rooms. I'm just trying to, where is my slide deck? So one of them is, we're really interested in knowing how you're using community insight to develop policy at a borough level, and what type of community insight are you using and across what policy areas? And then what are the key needs and barriers for policy and strategy teams in terms of using community insight in developing policy? We highlighted a number of barriers that we experience, and then what intervention could the GLA lead to support boroughs and other partners to use community insights confidently? So how can we support you as policy people to do that better in the city? So I did put together a Jamboard, so if people want to just like dump thoughts in that, that's also fine. But yeah, looking forward to hearing more in the breakout rooms.
That's great. So I've set the breakout rooms up. There'll be a GLA facilitator in each of your breakout rooms, and then I'm going to kind of reshare the Jamboard so that it hits all of your breakout rooms while you get there. So I'm going to open us up, and we'll all go into breakout rooms, and we'll come back at about 10, between 10:02 and 5:02 to conclude. Right.
Thank you.
Hi, Noel.
Oh, hi there. I'm just going to assign you to breakout. Just bear with me one moment. Right, so this might be a breakout room in and of itself. So I'm just gonna. So kind of got a few questions here, but we don't need to tackle them all if we want to dwell on one particular one. So the first one is, are we using kind of community insight to develop policy or kind of strategy in your organisations, and what are the kind of the key needs that you've got in terms of your teams in how you use that insight from local communities? And then the last one was, what could the GLA do to better support kind of boroughs and partners to use these more effectively? So I don't know if we want to do maybe intros first before we go into that. Who wants to kick off?
I can kick off. I'm not from a local authority. I'm actually with University College London, and I research how local authorities learn and make policy in the area of housing innovation, architectural innovation, building on technically complex sites. And I've also missed a lot of this session. Apologies, just working from home, multiple things going on. So I've actually missed the first half. My apologies.
Who wants to go next? I'm gonna have to dive into each of the breakout rooms to make sure people are all okay. So I'll let you continue the intros and kind of conversation.
I'm Dr. Callahan, strategy and policy.
Oh, you might be on mute.
Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, so